日本史学習に最高にもってこいのサイトサムライアーカイブスポッドキャストへようこそ。美しい自然にあふれてる縄文時代から波乱万丈な幕末まで全時代を網羅して日本史の隅から隅まで一緒に語り合いましょう。では早速日本史の世界へ。
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Samurai Archives podcast. This is Chris, and today I'm back with Elijah Bender, where we'll continue our conversation about Ghost of Tsushima. And before we get started, be sure to check out patreon.com/Samurai Archives to see how you can support the podcast. And thanks to all of our current patrons as well. All right, and let's get started. How about the story itself as it progresses? How does it? I mean, obviously, you don't want to give away spoilers, but in the progression, though, does it continue to sort of stay true to what it should, or are there? I don't know. Is there anything that really stands out to you as a problem, or done well, or as the story progresses?
I'll be honest with you. So I haven't played. It's a long game, and you could easily spend probably 50, 60 hours on this game. I've played about 15 hours, I think, but I'm probably halfway through the main quest, and it's I think it's pretty straightforward in terms of samurai who is you're basically learning these like sort of covert ninja type skills, if you will, in order to undermine the Mongol invasion. So it doesn't really stray too far from that path, and the main character's progression is like to more and more embrace fighting in this way in which he was not trained, but for the greater good. And there's a romance in there too but basically he's sort of conflicted because his dead uncle is the one who trained him and was this very upright, honorable samurai. And then the love interest is this like thief character, right? Who is sort of encouraging him to be more, less by the book, I guess, let's say. So that's the basic.
Sounds like an Adam Sandler movie plot.
Well, I guess when you describe it that way, but
like the sort of the nerdy sort of guy that needs to have everything scheduled out, and then there's the crazy girl that tries to get him out of his rut.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of like that in a much more serious context. But for Jin Sakai, the main character, that is a big part of the game is like this character saying, all right, you can't just charge in there. There's 15 guys in there. You can't just charge in there and like fight. And he's like, well, but that's the way samurai are supposed to do it, And she's like, no, let's sneak in the back door. We'll slit this guy's throat, steal this thing, and that, so it's that type of stuff. And your main character becomes more and more adept at that as the game goes on.
I feel like that sort of trope actually does come from a lot of Japanese movies where you have it's like a kunoichi or someone turns into the love interest.
Exactly. She is very much she's not called that in the game, but she's very much a kunoichi character. So
it sounds like they dived deep into Japanese pop culture to sort of throw in as many tropes as they could.
Well, I think so.
But tropes that are true to the source material, I guess you'd say.
And so I want to give them a lot of credit for doing that. They made a game that really feels like to me it feels like a real samurai story. And I mean real samurai story in that like something that a Japanese company would make, So that's good. I think that is good. And I'm sure there was a lot of Japanese people involved in the making of this game. So kudos there for like some real cultural awareness, in bringing those things to life in a game that's aimed at, American audiences, Western audiences, I guess, English speaking, however you want to say it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it sounds like they put in the work. But one thing I was wondering is So if you were the king of the world, right, and you had your own game design company, and you could put it in a particular historical time frame, maybe particular characters and
Mhm.
or a type of game, gameplay, et cetera, et cetera, what would you put together? What magical game would you build?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to answer that in just a second, but I want to say one more thing by way of praise that I should have said earlier, because you asked me a good question about the game. And that is that visually, the attention to detail and the accuracy with which a lot of things are rendered in the game is really impressive. So the costumes, the settings, things like shrines and temples and um, robes that the characters wear, pieces of armor, etc. Even if some of it is anachronistic for the period that is being depicted, they really nailed it visually. Um, so I just want to say that that was really impressive too, and great to see. I mean, it's like super fun to see this like beautifully rendered piece of oyoroi, on a samurai that has like you can see the individual little colored cords and stuff like that. It's pretty awesome. In terms of what game, if I was king of the world, I probably wouldn't be designing games, but let's say that I was. I would make a game out of something that I've actually used in my samurai history class, which is this role-playing game based on the Warring States period. And it's sort of like a combination between Risk and like Monopoly and D&D, but it's basically you play as a daimyo, as a kokujin, a kind of mid-level regional samurai, a village, or a religious institution, a shrine or a temple. And it has this really kind of geopolitical focus where you're trying to maintain your own survival at the same time as maybe expand your influence, maybe conquer territory. And the way that I play this game with my class is there's a lot of like wheeling and dealing that has to go on. So if you're a daimyo, you have to convince people to join you. You have to convince lower level samurai to join you. What are you going to offer them? What are you going to do for them? You have to convince villages to join you. You have to convince merchants to come to your town. You've got to make a truce with the big Buddhist temple or whatever it is. If you're a village, it's same thing, right? You're sort of negotiating between what lord are we going to submit to, or are we going to join this big iki and fight against these samurai. And it's the way that I would do it in the game is it's sort of turn based, and you would have a range of like abilities that are innate to your class, let's say, and things that you can upgrade. And then each location as well would give you sort of pluses and minuses in terms of what you can and can't do. So that's the game that I would make first.
So a bit of a Nobunaga's Ambition type game.
Yeah, it'd be a lot like that, I think, except I would try to just really like lean into the like reconstruction of actual historical phenomenon, and in particular, my big goal in a game like that, and one of my big goals when I do this exercise in class, is to show that it's not the conflict of the Warring States period is not just about samurai. Samurai are there, obviously, they have a huge influence, but it's sort of everybody is armed to the teeth and kind of duking it out over this stuff. And I think that makes it a lot of fun when students realize that, like, oh, hey, these Buddhist temples had stuff going on, and the villages could band together and they had their own militias, and then if they join together in this big iki, then they can like take over a whole province. So that's what I would try to do with the game is make it not just about samurai, but about this really like dynamic era where you've got all kinds of contenders in there.
I'd play it.
I figured you would. I would play it too if I just had a way to.
One other thing I was thinking about was, a lot of the reviews kind of, I don't remember any specifics, but they were kind of like, they're just bringing up these sort of generic tropes of Japanese culture. And one thing I had realized earlier actually is that the Japanese do that themselves a lot. Like look at Yakuza films, right? So I was watching this show on Netflix, Giri Haji, which I think is a BBC production, which is actually really good, by the way. But there were complaints about that, like, oh, the Yakuza are these, paper cutouts that are only concerned with honor and discipline, and they follow orders without a word. And it's like, oh, but that's exactly how they're portrayed in the Japanese movies.
Right.
This isn't an American, or this isn't a Western, cultural, I don't know what you would even call it, but no, this is actually how the Japanese portray it.
Right.
This is the trope that they use.
Totally.
So, yeah, so sometimes I think people don't realize that the source material that this is inspired by or that it's coming from is sort of just as tropey and ridiculous to the Japanese, but they're the ones that are actuactually making it.
Right. And
if
that's
that
the
makes
point.
sense.
I mean, I think that you said it a lot better than I did earlier, but that's what I was trying to get across with, a lot of credit is due to the game designers here for really faithfully recreating that the tropes and the conventions of the samurai genre, the samurai epic story genre, or whatever you want to call it. They nailed it. I mean, it's like you could make this a Kurosawa movie if you wanted to. You could take this game and like turn it into a Kurosawa film, and it would like hit all of the right notes. So yeah, I think that there is something to that. It's important to understand that. Again, it gets back to what I'm saying about being more interested in what the narrative is actually doing. Like, what is the purpose of this narrative, and like why do we find it compelling? To me, that's the much more interesting question than is this historically accurate or not?
Right. I've always noticed people that like to harp on that stuff are really annoying.
Yes, and I try not to be that annoying samurai professor who is constantly reminding you that it wasn't actually that way. When you bring up Yakuza films, though, it's really interesting because that is the way that Yakuza are portrayed. Is there's a lot of crossover, right, with the way that samurai culture is portrayed in Japanese media. And I think that if you sort of take a glance at that and you're like, oh, well, there's, that's just pop culture, whatever. But there's a little bit more to it than that. Obviously, the Yakuza themselves, or, the people who practice Gokudo, the extreme way, they view themselves as sort of latter-day samurai, right? They draw a lot of inspiration from samurai history and samurai mythology and so on, samurai legends, if you will.
And from Western mafia movies too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's an amalgam of a lot of things, but I think that we would be, you can't dismiss the real connection that does exist, especially between like early modern samurai political culture and Yakuza culture, contemporary like Yakuza culture. One of my teachers, my main teacher, in fact, Luke Roberts, who's a Japanese history professor at UCSB, he has always said, and I believe him, that if you want to understand how the Edo period government worked, look at the way that Yakuza operate. Like look at the way that Yakuza organizations are run. So in terms of the hierarchy, the structure, the way that authority functions, that's the that's the closest thing that exists in contemporary Japan to the way that the early modern, political system worked.
That's super interesting because that never occurred to me.
Yeah, and I mean, so Luke is a specialist on early modern Japan, and he's written a couple books about like political economy. He's not a specialist on Yakuza, so I don't want to sort of mislead people that like he's written a bunch of comparative histories about these two things, but just that's kind of his basic observation. That I think there's a lot to that in terms of the way that some of your listeners may or may not be familiar with Luke's book, Performing the Great Peace, but it's all about this sort of performance of compliance and outward shows of deference versus like the messy business of how stuff actually gets done. And I think that there's a lot of crossover there with Yakuza culture in terms of saving face and shows of deference to superiors and emphasis on rigid hierarchy and so on.
Yeah, I think actually his book has come up on the podcast before. And also, shout out to Luke Roberts. He's actually a great writer because he can take topics that, look really uninteresting. Like he wrote an article on, I think it was like the 18th century voting boxes in Tosa province or something like that.
Yeah, the petition box.
And that's it, the petition boxes. And it was a very interesting article, despite sounding very boring. So
yeah.
I think he's a very good writer in addition to historian. Yeah,
he is. He's a great writer. He's a terrific teacher, good friend as well. But that's I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know anybody who, at least in English, is like explicitly looking at that comparison between early modern political economy and like the contemporary Yakuza.
Someone just figured out the PhD thesis.
Yeah, there you go. Well, okay. I mean, but so you have, that's just one Japanese historian says that there's probably something there. And I would certainly read that dissertation.
Oh, I would definitely read it too. I wouldn't want to write it, but I'd read it. So let's see, anything else stand out about the game that you can think of at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had one more observation that I wanted to sort of throw out there. It's a bit more of a general one, but it definitely applies here. And something that I've noticed as, I guess for lack of a better, we've been talking about these sort of tropes in samurai films, right? And I think that there's a growing awareness that that didn't really line up with historical samurai in terms of this great emphasis on honor and loyalty and so on. And so I'm seeing as that awareness grows, there's sort of this tendency to kind of say, oh no, samurai were dishonorable. Samurai were, they were nothing like the way that they're portrayed. They were, just these thugs and so on. And there's some truth to that. But let's not forget that virtually every armed force that you can think of, virtually every class of professional warriors that you can think of in the pre-modern era, basically functions as a goon squad. And I think that we would be remiss if we just simply dismiss the idea that samurai, that they're just a bunch of thugs who fail to live up to any kind of standards, because samurai did have, even in the 13th century or the 12th or 11th or what have you, they had a very clear sense of what honor was. It just didn't correspond to what we might think is honorable. It didn't correspond to that early modern version of honor, which was, supreme fealty and loyalty to a lord. The samurai have a very strong sense of autonomy. That's what it was to be an honorable samurai, was to be an autonomous being who's able to sort of stand up for yourself, make a name for yourself, and make a name for your lineage, right? I don't know if this book's ever come up on your podcast, but Eiko Ikegami, The Taming of the Samurai, one of my favorite works on samurai history. It's from the 90s, but it's an oldie, but boy, is it a goodie. And Ikegami's basic thesis is that what is samurai honor? It's autonomy. I think she calls it honorific individualism. But if you realize that, and you realize that to be an honorable samurai is to always assert your autonomy no matter what, then these early medieval samurai start to make a lot more sense. When you read like all the terrible stuff that they do and how they switch sides all the time and how they're, constantly backstabbing and doing this and that, they start to make a little bit more sense when you realize that it's really about like standing up for yourself, making a name for yourself, and sort of showing off, if nothing else. One of my favorite illustrations of this is the cause of the Eikyo Rebellion, 1438 Eikyo Rebellion. It's one of the many Muromachi era rebellions, right? So 1438, the shogun and I think he's the Kanto Kanrei. He's either the Kanto Kanrei or the Kamakura Kubo, but the shogun is Ashikaga Yoshinori, and he refuses to give the Kanto Kanrei. The Kanto Kanrei is his son is having a coming of age ceremony, and Yoshinori refuses to give that son one of his name characters, which is like basically a big middle finger to this guy. And they've had beef for some time at this point, the shogun and the Kanto Kanrei. And so that is the thing that like starts this big rebellion, right? The Kanto Kanrei is like, well, screw this guy, and he rounds up a bunch of his people, and that's what causes the Eikyo Rebellion. And so you look at that and it's like, it's not something that's just silly, right? Like that insult had real stakes to these people. And so, it clearly had a sense of honor, clearly had a sense that like, I cannot let this stand. This is like a life and death thing. I've got to assert myself here. I think that that's a good illustration of the fact that the early modern, or rather the early medieval kind of mercenary style samurai, they still did have a kind of a honor. It just functioned very differently than what you might expect.
Yeah, I haven't actually read that book, but it has come up on the podcast. But that's a really interesting way to look at it. It's never really occurred to me to look at it that way. But that does sort of fly in the face of the typical, well, I guess I don't know what you call it, the fanboy idea of like serve the Lord regardless, and sort of flies in the face of that. But it actually makes a lot more sense than that because that's what you see throughout Japanese history.
Right.
Is this Lord isn't doing what he's supposed to be doing, screw this guy. Or he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, we're going to have him commit seppuku, and then I'm going to install an heir,
right?
So that we all benefit, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think that it's sort of this fundamental realization that opens a lot of doors if you are studying samurai history, because it's not just as you put it, the fanboy version of honorable samurai. Well, okay, we know that is manufactured, but it's also not that. Samurai were a bunch of just dishonorable, thugs, right? Because that's sort of like the other extreme, where it's like, oh, it's all hogwash, this is all this samurai stuff. It's a bunch of baloney. Well, not really. I mean, they actually did have a very strong sense of honor. It just, the way it operates, it's all wrapped up in individualism and autonomy. Once you make that realization, then it's like, okay, I can totally see why, this is, if you're studying Muromachi history, for example, yes, this is why, 15 rebellions happen in 15 years. Yeah,
it is a very, I don't know what the technical term is, but like a tit for tat type system where, the Lord does for you and you do for him, and when he stops providing for you, then you stop providing for him. It's a very tit for tat type system. So that does make sense, taking it that one step further, where it's a very individualistic system.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's not just that sort of mercenary mentality that you're talking about, but it also applies to like your peer group, right? So, if somebody, not only if somebody does something to wrong you, obviously you can't let that stand. And if your Lord and your followers don't support you, then that is also, they've also wronged you. But it's also, you have to sort of actively work to set yourself like above your peers, right? Going back to, for example, Takezaki Suenaga's scrolls, right? You've probably talked about these on the podcast before, but Thomas Conlon wrote a book about them. And this was a guy who was actually involved in the Mongol invasions in 1274 and 1281. And he didn't feel like he got rewarded properly afterwards. And so he commissioned a series of scrolls that recounted his exploits in these battles as a way to like make the case to the shogun that he needed to be rewarded more. But the point is that the stuff that he says about what is noteworthy about his service, it's all things that like set him apart. It's like, I was the first to charge into the line in this battle or that battle. I killed, these 3 people, and, here, so-and-so saw me do it. Here's the heads. I presented them to such and such commander after the battle. I was the one who, found where the enemy camp was, or, it's stuff like that, where it's all about you standing out. Right.
I mean, the level of marketing genius in that is just so hilarious. The idea that he's like, I'm going to go have some guy make up some scrolls for me. I'm going to take him to the shogunate and be like, hey, check this out. Check out my exploits.
I know, right? It's what a terrific historical source that is. But yeah, for those of you, if you're interested in this, Thomas Conlon, his book In Little Need of Divine Intervention. He also has a website, really great interactive stuff there that talks about this guy. But I think a superb glimpse into, a medieval samurai kind of mindset, right? And how they thought of themselves, what they thought honor was. This is what it was, like, showing off and standing up for yourself, right?
I guess, which is what Jin had to learn to triumph against the Mongols in Ghost of Tsushima. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is kind of that, although it's more like him making peace with the necessity to sort of undermine his uncle's teachings, but he ultimately realizes that it's for the greater good of the Kuni, of Tsushima no Kuni.
Does he at least have one Yoda-like master?
It's his uncle. His uncle is the Zen master, and so throughout the game there's these flashbacks, right, to like training episodes that he had as a child, and wisdom that his uncle imparted to him. So,
well, I don't know. Is there anything else that you can think of?
I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to say. I mean, it's a really good game. I think it's a lot of fun to play, and I would love to see more like samurai stuff like this. I think that there's a lot of room for cool stories to be told, and as the interest and awareness grows, I think that you'll see maybe more of that nuance and kind of complexity develop with the samurai genre.
Oh yeah, because one thing people don't seem to realize is even within the realm of gaming, you've got a good 800 years worth of material to choose from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love seeing pre-modern Japan, depicted graphically. It's really cool. So.
All right. So we've hit an hour, so I think we're good.
All right.
I guess probably the best way to go is to have you put out whatever social media information that you want for contact. So why don't you go ahead and give them your Twitter information?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Professor_Jedi. Professor_Jedi.
Awesome. All right. Thanks.
All right.
Okay, and that's it for another episode of the Samurai Archives podcast. And before I let you go, be sure to check out patreon.com/Samurai Archives to see how you can support the podcast, but also to get your hands on some of the interesting bonus content that we have over there. Okay, and thanks again to all of our patrons, and see you next time.